In early 2026, ExxonMobil told its shareholders what it intended to spend that year: between $27 and $29 billion in cash capital expenditure. Wells in the Permian Basin, platforms off Guyana, refineries, pipelines, chemical plants, everything required to pull hydrocarbons out of the earth and convert them into cash. The company noted, without much modesty, that its planned investment ran roughly 20% above the nearest international oil major. In the world of oil, that is the top of the mountain. In the same season, Microsoft set its capital spending for calendar year 2026 at approximately $190 billion. Not 29, 190. A single software company planning to spend more than 6 times what the most aggressive oil major on the planet would spend, and spending almost all of it on one category of physical object: buildings full of electricity and silicon. Now widen the frame. Add Amazon at roughly $200 billion. Add Alphabet, guiding toward the mid-170s. Add Meta, which raised its own projection past $140 billion. Analysts totaling the 4 largest American cloud operators arrived at a figure near $725 billion for 2026 alone, an increase of roughly 77% over the previous year. That is not a technology budget anymore. That is an industrial revolution with a quarterly earnings call attached. For 150 years, the most valuable asset a company could own was a hole in the ground with pressure behind it. Oil fields built empires, redrew borders, decided wars, and made a handful of families and a smaller handful of states permanently rich. The logic was simple enough to explain to a child: find the reserve, control the flow, and the world will keep buying because the world cannot function without it. Every stock exchange on Earth learned to price that logic. Every foreign ministry learned to defend it. Something has shifted underneath that logic, and it happened faster than almost anyone forecast. The world's largest pools of capital, sovereign wealth funds, infrastructure giants, private credit desks, are now competing for a different kind of reserve. Not crude, not gas, powered land. Concrete floor space with a guaranteed connection to a substation, cooled and secured and leased for 15 years to a company whose product is prediction. Rystad Energy calculated that data center investment in 2025 surpassed upstream oil and gas investment outright, and projected 2026 spending to match the entire oil and gas value chain, upstream, midstream, downstream, plus renewable generation combined. This is a story about how an asset class dies and another one is born. Not through drama, but through arithmetic. And the arithmetic starts with a question almost nobody asks. What actually made an oil field valuable in the first place? An oil field is not valuable because it contains oil. It is valuable because of 4 properties that took the industry a century to learn how to price. The first is scarcity that cannot be manufactured. You cannot decide to build a gawar. Geology decided 60 million years ago, and no amount of capital reverses that. The second is flow rate. Not how much is down there, but how fast it comes up, because a barrel in 2030 is worth less than a barrel today. The third is duration. A well is a machine that pays you for 20, 30, sometimes 50 years, and that long tail is what allows a bank to lend against it. The fourth is fungibility. A barrel of Brent is a barrel of Brent, whether it surfaces in the North Sea or gets traded 11 times before it reaches a refinery. Put those 4 together and you get something remarkable. An asset that a lender will finance, a state will defend, and an accountant will book on a balance sheet, decades before the revenue arrives. That last piece, reserve-based lending, where the collateral is a resource still underground, is the financial engine that built modern energy. The reserve became the credit. The entire architecture of 20th century geopolitics rests on those 4 properties. The Strait of Hormuz matters because flow rate matters. OPEC exists because scarcity that cannot be manufactured can, however, be coordinated. Sovereign wealth funds exist because duration produces surplus that outlives the government that collected it. Nations built navies around the logic of the reserve. So when someone claims a new asset has replaced the oil field, the honest test is not whether it is fashionable or expensive. The test is whether it has those same 4 properties, or whether it has different ones that turn out to matter more. Hold that framework, because a modern AI data center passes some of that test in ways that should genuinely unsettle an energy executive, and fails other parts in ways that should unsettle everyone financing it. The scarcity is real, but it is not geological. The duration is contested, and the fight over exactly how long the asset lasts is now the loudest argument in American accounting. Fungibility barely exists at all. And flow rate has become the single most important number in the industry, except it is no longer measured in barrels per day. It is measured in megawatts. To see why, you have to stop thinking of a data center as a building. Almost everything confusing about this boom dissolves the moment you understand what is actually being bought. Drive past one and you will be unimpressed. A long gray shed, windowless, set back from a county road behind a berm and a chain link fence. No signage, no windows to speak of. A gravel lot with maybe 40 cars in it, because a facility that costs several $1 billion might employ fewer people than the grocery store you passed on the way. The shed is not the asset. The shed is packaging. What is being purchased in almost every transaction in this industry is a legal and physical claim on electricity, delivered continuously at a specific site, at a specific voltage, starting on a specific date. Everything else is a wrapper around that claim. The industry has a term for it that tells you everything. Powered land. Not land, powered land. Dirt with an interconnection agreement is worth an order of magnitude more than the identical dirt across the road without one, and the gap has widened every year since 2022. This is why the unit of account changed. Nobody serious values these facilities by square footage anymore, the way you would an office park. They are valued by critical IT load, megawatts of power that can actually be delivered to computing equipment continuously with redundancy. A 100-megawatt campus is not a big building. It is a small city's worth of demand running flat 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, with a load profile so stable that grid operators describe it as unlike anything they have planned for. And inside that wrapper sits the part that actually generates revenue, the graphics processors. In a modern AI facility, the physical structure, steel, concrete, cooling, switchgear, backup generation, often represents a minority of the total invested capital. The majority is silicon that arrives on pallets installed by contractors, obsolete in a time frame nobody can agree on. That inversion has no equivalent in oil. The derrick is cheap and the reservoir is priceless. Here, the reservoir is the grid connection, and the drilling equipment costs more than the field and depreciates while you watch. So you have an asset with a geological scale constraint, electricity, which cannot be conjured, wrapped around a consumable that behaves more like inventory than infrastructure. That contradiction sits at the center of everything that follows, and the market has not resolved it. What the market has done instead is spend, at a scale that makes the entire history of energy investment look modest by comparison. There is a specific moment when a new asset class overtakes an old one, and for most of history, you can only identify it in hindsight. This one happened in public, in a spreadsheet, and almost nobody outside of finance noticed. Global data center capital expenditure reached roughly $770 billion in 2025. In that same year, that figure passed global upstream oil and gas investment. Not gas stations, not refineries. Upstream, the exploration and production spending that is the beating heart of the energy industry. The number that determines whether the world has oil in 2032. Computing infrastructure now consumes more capital than finding hydrocarbons. Rystad Energy went further, projecting that 2026 data center investment would rival total spending across the whole oil and gas value chain, plus renewable power generation. Separate forecasts put global data center capex above $1 trillion for 2026. To place that in scale, $1 trillion a year sustained is comparable to the annual GDP of the Netherlands, spent on a single category of industrial construction that did not meaningfully exist in its current form 8 years ago. The composition of that money matters as much as the size. Historically, energy capex was funded by energy revenue. You drilled with the cash from the last well. The current build-out is funded from a stranger place, the operating cash flow of software businesses with the highest margins in commercial history, supplemented by an expanding wall of debt. Cloud and advertising profits, generated at 80% gross margin, are being converted into concrete and copper at a rate the world has not seen since the post-war interstate and grid buildouts. And here is the part that makes energy people uncomfortable. Oil and gas capex is disciplined by price. When crude falls, budgets fall, rigs stack, and the industry contracts. That feedback loop is brutal, but it is real. And it has been the industry's immune system for 40 years. AI capex has no equivalent signal yet. There is no daily traded price for a unit of intelligence. There is only demand forecasting, competitive fear, and the conviction that being second in this market is worse than overspending in it. Companies have said plainly that underbuilding is the greater risk. Which raises the obvious question. If the money is unconstrained by price, what constrains it? Something has to. And the answer turned out to be the oldest, least glamorous, most stubbornly physical thing in the industrial world. Electricity. The International Energy Agency put numbers on it in its Energy and AI report. Data centers consumed roughly 415 terawatt hours of electricity in 2024, about 1.5% of world consumption. By 2030, the agency projects that figure more than doubles to around 945 terawatt hours, slightly more than the entire electricity consumption of Japan. Demand from AI-optimized facilities specifically is projected to more than quadruple. In the United States, the agency expects data centers to account for almost half of all electricity demand growth between now and 2030, an increase of up to 240 terawatt hours, roughly 130% above 2024 levels. For 20 years, American electricity demand was essentially flat. Efficiency gains canceled out growth. Utilities built their entire planning culture, their rate cases, their workforce, and their capital models around a world where load did not increase. That world ended, and it ended in about 36 months. Understand what this does to the value of an existing grid connection. If demand is flat, a substation is a cost center. If demand is exploding and new transmission takes 7 to 10 years to permit and build, an existing, energized, contracted connection becomes something closer to a mineral right. It is scarce, it is location-specific, it cannot be manufactured on demand, and someone will pay enormous sums for it. Property 1 of the reserve, satisfied. Not by geology, but by permitting timelines and steel supply chains. The queues tell the story better than any forecast. Across American grid regions, requests to interconnect new load and new generation stretch into the 2030s. In the largest markets, developers are not waiting for construction crews. They're waiting for a utility to confirm that in 5 years, there will be electrons. S&P Global put United States utility capital expenditure forecasts near $1.25 trillion for the 2026 to 2030 window, driven substantially by this demand. And when a resource becomes scarce, its price moves. That price signal appeared in one of the least watched auctions in American economic life, and it landed on the electricity bills of 67 million people who never asked to participate. Every year, the grid operator PJM Interconnection runs a capacity auction. It is not an auction for electricity. It is an auction for the promise that generation will exist and be available when demand peaks. Insurance against the lights going out, purchased on behalf of everyone in a territory stretching from Chicago to the Atlantic. For years, this auction was a technical footnote. Then, the numbers moved. Capacity cleared at $269.92 per megawatt day for the 2025 to 2026 delivery year, an increase of roughly 9-fold over the prior period across most of the region. The following year, it cleared at $329.17. The year after that, $333.44, a record for the third consecutive auction. In 2 eastern zones, the 2025 to 26 price went higher still, $466 per megawatt day in the Baltimore Gas and Electric Zone and $444 in Dominion's Virginia territory, which is, not coincidentally, where the world's densest concentration of data centers sits. PJM's own independent market monitor did the attribution. Data center load growth drove 63% of the 2025 to 26 price increase, translating into roughly $9.3 billion of capacity cost attributable to data centers. The market monitor's later analysis attributed billions more in a subsequent auction. This is not an advocacy group's estimate. It is the market's designated referee. Those costs do not stay in a spreadsheet. they flow into distribution rates and arrive on household bills. PJM's own projection put customer bill increases from the capacity spike in the range of 1.5% to 5%, varying by state and utility. Independent analysts have projected considerably steeper increases for average households by 2028. And here, the story stops being financial and becomes political. Because a retired school teacher in Ohio now pays a measurably higher electricity bill as a consequence of capacity procured for computing load she does not use, cannot see, and did not vote on. That is the moment an asset class becomes a public question. Oil learned this lesson at gas pumps in 1973. Computing is learning it on utility bills in 2026. And the industry's response to the constraint was to do what oil companies have always done when the resource gets tight. Stop waiting for the market and go by the source directly. In September 2024, Constellation Energy and Microsoft announced something that would have sounded absurd a decade earlier. Unit 1 at 3 Mile Island, the site of the most famous nuclear accident in American history, shut down in 2019 for economic reasons, would be restarted, renamed the Crane Clean Energy Center, and its output committed to Microsoft under a 20-year power purchase agreement. 835 megawatts, enough by Constellation's description to supply roughly 800,000 homes. Read that structure carefully because it is the oil playbook translated. A 20-year offtake agreement for the full output of a specific generating asset is functionally identical to a long-term liquefied natural gas contract. A buyer with a credit rating strong enough to underwrite a multi-billion-dollar project decides to secure supply for 2 decades rather than buy at market. In energy, that is called vertical integration. It is what Standard Oil did with pipelines and what the majors did with tankers. The restart has not been simple. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has spent 2026 conducting intensive on-site inspections and reviewing license amendments, a process running through the year. PJM has flagged that some transmission upgrades associated with the site could extend toward 2030 or 2031. Even with a 20-year contract and one of the largest balance sheets on Earth behind it, physical infrastructure moves at the speed of physical infrastructure. So the industry looked for something faster and found the same bottleneck waiting there. GE Vernova, one of 3 manufacturers who together account for roughly 75% of large-frame gas turbine production, has effectively sold out its turbine slots through 2030. Its gas power equipment backlog and slot reservation agreements grew to 116 gigawatts, with the company targeting at least 125 gigawatts by the end of 2026. Buyers are now paying to reserve a place in line for machines that will be manufactured years from now. GE Vernova has said roughly 20% of that contracted volume is explicitly tied to data center load. This is what a genuine physical constraint looks like. Not a shortage of ambition, not a shortage of money, a shortage of turbines, transformers, high-voltage cable, and licensed nuclear operators. And when a resource is constrained by geography and hardware rather than by capital, the map starts doing what the map always does. It concentrates the wealth in very specific places. There is a county in Northern Virginia that generates more internet traffic than most nations. Loudoun County, 30 miles from Washington, built its position on a historical accident. Fiber routes laid in the 1990s near the early internet exchange points, and then compounded it for 3 decades. Locals call the corridor Data Center Alley. The rest of the industry calls it the most expensive dirt in the digital economy. The market data explains why. Northern Virginia closed 2025 as the largest data center market in the world, with a vacancy rate of roughly half of 1%. Half of 1%. In commercial real estate, 5% is considered tight. 96% of the supply scheduled to deliver in 2026 was already pre-committed before it was finished. Land values in Loudoun climbed into the range of $2 to $3 million per acre before developers began pushing into neighboring Prince William County, and county-level analysis showed values rising 45% in a single year. Then the same thing happened that happens in every extractive boom. When the best field is fully leased, capital moves to the frontier. Development pushed south towards Stafford, Spotsylvania, and Richmond, and then out of the state entirely, to places selected for exactly 2 attributes: available power and permissive permitting. West Texas, Louisiana, Central Ohio, Northern Georgia, Wyoming. Abilene, Texas is the clearest case. A city of about 120,000 people, better known for cattle and a small Christian university, became the flagship site of the Stargate project, the joint venture involving OpenAI, Oracle, and SoftBank. Crusoe Energy Systems, the developer, secured $11.6 billion in funding commitments for the build, with total capital raised for the project reaching roughly $15 billion. 2 buildings went live first, with the full campus designed toward roughly 1.2 gigawatts. 1.2 gigawatts on the outskirts of Abilene, Texas. Look at the selection criteria, and the parallel becomes exact. Oil went where the geology was, regardless of politics, then negotiated with whoever was there. Compute goes where the megawatts are, regardless of population, then negotiates with the county commission. In both cases, an enormous amount of national wealth becomes attached to a handful of unremarkable places that did nothing to earn it, except sit in the right spot. And in both cases, the people who own that spot are rarely the people who live there. Ask who owns the data centers, and most people will answer with the logos they know. Amazon, Google, Microsoft. That answer is increasingly wrong, and the correction is the most important ownership shift in infrastructure this decade. On the 21st of July, 2026, a consortium closed the largest acquisition of a data center company in history. Aligned Data Centers, 51 campuses, more than 6.4 gigawatts of operational and planned capacity, was purchased from Macquarie Asset Management at an enterprise value of approximately $40 billion. The buyers were BlackRock's global infrastructure partners, the Abu Dhabi state-backed investor MGX, and the AI Infrastructure Partnership. They committed a further $5 billion for expansion. The previous record for a deal of this type was the $16.6 billion paid for the Asia-Pacific operator AirTrunk in 2024. The record more than doubled in under 2 years. Look at that buyer list again, because it is not a technology consortium. It is an infrastructure consortium. These are the same institutions that own toll roads, airports, ports, pipelines, and regulated utilities. Investors whose entire business model is acquiring assets with long contracted cash flows and predictable inflation-linked revenue. When that class of capital arrives, it is a signal. They are not betting on artificial intelligence being transformative. They are betting that a 15-year lease with an investment-grade tenant secured to an irreplaceable grid connection behaves like a pipeline. And the seller side matters just as much. Macquarie, the Australian firm that spent 2 decades building the modern infrastructure asset class out of airports and utilities, exited at a valuation that would have been unimaginable when it entered. The specialists in long-duration physical assets have decided that digital infrastructure is the same trade with a better growth rate. The consequence is that ownership of the most valuable industrial asset of the decade is migrating away from the operating companies and toward pools of institutional capital, pension funds, insurers, sovereign wealth. The tenant runs the compute. The landlord owns the megawatt. In oil, that separation took a century and an antitrust case to produce. Here, it took about 4 years. But infrastructure investors do not buy assets with equity alone. They buy them with leverage. And the debt that has been assembled behind this build-out is now large enough to have its own gravity. Every mature asset class eventually gets financialized. Oil got there through reserve-based lending, banks advancing capital against proven reserves still in the ground, then packaging and syndicating that exposure until the credit became larger and more mobile than the barrels underneath it. Data centers are moving through the same transition, and moving through it fast. AI data center debt issuance exceeded $200 billion in 2025. Morgan Stanley projected $250 to $300 billion from hyperscalers alone in 2026. Bloomberg described the build-out as becoming all-consuming for debt markets, a $3 trillion construction program that has to be financed somewhere and increasingly is not being financed out of operating cash flow. The instruments are recognizable to anyone who studied the last credit cycle. Data center asset-backed securities package the lease payments from facilities into rated bonds sold to institutional buyers. JP Morgan projected annual data center securitization issuance at $30 to $40 billion in both 2026 and 2027, up from about $27 billion in 2025, potentially reaching 7 to 10% of the entire ABS market. Data centers now represent roughly 61% of the $79 billion market for digital infrastructure securitizations. In July 2026, Aligned Data Centers completed a single securitization of $1.18 billion, upsized about 30% from its initial target because demand exceeded supply. Alongside the public markets sits private credit, which has become the principal source of external financing for the sector. The capital stack has evolved from straightforward real estate lending into a layered structure of private credit, securitization, and joint ventures between developers and hyperscalers. Some of this debt is now secured against the graphics processors themselves. None of that is inherently unstable. Securitization is how most durable infrastructure gets built, and a bond backed by 15 years of payments from a company with a AAA credit rating is a genuinely conservative instrument. The question that credit analysts are asking is narrower and sharper. What exactly is the collateral, and how long does it last? For a pipeline, the answer is 40 years. For a toll road, longer. For a building full of processors, the honest answer is that the industry does not agree. And that disagreement has become the loudest accounting argument in American finance. Before that argument, there is a structural feature of this boom that has no clean parallel in energy, and it deserves to be stated plainly, rather than dramatically. OpenAI has accumulated compute commitments across multiple vendors reported to total approximately $1.4 trillion over the coming decade. The individual pieces are public. A cloud agreement with Oracle, reported at $300 billion, described at signing as the largest cloud contract ever written. Roughly $250 billion of committed purchases from Microsoft, announced arrangements with Broadcom, AMD, Amazon, and CoreWeave, and an announced plan by NVIDIA to invest up to $100 billion into OpenAI, alongside OpenAI's commitment to purchase NVIDIA hardware. Set those flows next to each other, and the shape becomes visible. A chip manufacturer invests in a model developer. The model developer commits to buy chips and cloud capacity. The cloud providers use that committed revenue to justify purchasing more chips from the manufacturer. Bloomberg mapped these arrangements as circular deals. Independent analysts have put the interlocking commitments north of $800 billion. Each individual contract is ordinary commercial activity. The aggregate pattern is that a meaningful share of the sector's reported demand originates inside the sector. The scale mismatch is what makes analysts uneasy. OpenAI's revenue was reported at just over $20 billion, against estimated losses in the region of $14 billion for 2026. Commitments of $1.4 trillion require revenue growth of a magnitude that has essentially no precedent in corporate history. Some of the largest projects have already been resized against that reality. Oracle and OpenAI dropped plans to expand the flagship Abilene campus from roughly 1.2 gigawatts toward 2 gigawatts, with reporting citing financing conditions and changed demand forecasting. Oil had its own version of this: vertical integration, take-or-pay contracts, producers financing refiners who bought their crude. It is not novel, and it is not, by itself, evidence of anything improper. But it does mean that anyone valuing this asset class has to separate two different demand signals: the demand that comes from outside the industry, and the demand the industry has contracted with itself. Which brings us to the number that determines whether any of these assets are worth what the balance sheets say. In November 2025, the investor Michael Burry, known for correctly positioning against mortgage securities before 2008, published an argument about depreciation schedules. It sounds like the driest possible topic. It is, in fact, the entire question. Burry's claim was straightforward. Hyperscalers depreciate AI hardware over 5 or 6 years. Given how quickly NVIDIA releases new architectures, he argued, the real economic life of a leading-edge processor is closer to 2 or 3. Understating depreciation, he wrote, artificially boosts reported earnings. His estimate of the gap was roughly $176 billion of understated depreciation across the industry between 2026 and 2028, with some analysts calculating $50 to $60 billion annually if the true life is 3 years rather than 6. The counter-argument is substantive and comes from operators. NVIDIA has stated that customers consistently use 4 to 6 year depreciable lives based on observed utilization and equipment longevity. Older generations of chips do not stop working when a new one ships. They cascade down to inference workloads, to smaller customers, to less demanding tasks, generating revenue for years after they leave the frontier. Companies must defend these schedules to their auditors with utilization data and failure analysis. Both positions can be partly correct. The chip keeps producing, but produces less valuable output each year. Now compare that to the thing this asset is supposedly replacing. A conventional oil well declines on a predictable curve and produces for 20 to 40 years. Reserve engineering is a mature discipline with standardized reporting, audited by third parties, regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. When an oil company books a reserve, there is a defined methodology behind the number and a legal consequence for getting it wrong. There is no equivalent standard for the productive life of a graphics processor. And this is precisely where the reserve test from earlier in this video bites hardest. Scarcity, satisfied through power and permitting. Flow rate, satisfied, measured in megawatts. Fungibility, partially, since compute is increasingly traded as a commodity. Duration, unresolved. The asset that has attracted $1 trillion a year in capital has an unsettled answer to the most basic question a lender can ask, which is how long the collateral produces cash. That uncertainty has not slowed the money. It has, however, changed who is spending it, and the newest entrants are the ones with the most to lose from the old asset. If you wanted a single piece of evidence that the people closest to oil believe the asset is being displaced, you would not look at a forecast. You would look at where the oil money is going. In May 2025, a consortium announced Stargate UAE, an initiative to deploy 1 gigawatt of AI data center capacity in the Emirates, bringing together G42, OpenAI, Oracle, NVIDIA, Cisco, and SoftBank, backed by an investment reported between $8 and $10 billion, with 200 megawatts targeted for operation around 2026 to 2027. G42, a company operating dozens of facilities across the Emirates and backed by Abu Dhabi State Capital, is building the infrastructure. Reporting indicated the first stage would run on roughly 400,000 NVIDIA processors. Saudi Arabia moved along the same line. Humane, backed by the Public Investment Fund, signed agreements with American chip and infrastructure companies and announced a $1.2 billion financing arrangement with Saudi Arabia's National Infrastructure Fund to develop up to 250 megawatts of domestic capacity. Analysts tracking the region project more than 6 gigawatts of operational capacity across the Gulf by 2030, with total commitments across sovereign vehicles potentially approaching the $1 trillion range when fully counted. And MGX, Abu Dhabi's technology investment vehicle, was one of the 3 buyers of Aligned Data Centers in that record $40 billion transaction. Capital generated by hydrocarbons, deployed to acquire the American infrastructure that competes with hydrocarbons for capital, labor, and grid capacity. The strategic logic is legible without any conspiracy attached to it. A state whose revenue depends on a resource with a finite premium period converts that revenue into an asset with a different risk profile. That is textbook portfolio management. And Gulf states have said openly for years that diversification away from oil dependence is national policy. What is new is the destination. Previous diversification bought European football clubs, American real estate, semiconductor stakes, and infrastructure funds. This wave is buying compute, and specifically buying it at home, with domestic power and domestic land. Because the Gulf's genuine comparative advantage is exactly the thing the world is now short of: cheap energy and the political ability to build generation quickly. There is one asymmetry worth naming. Oil was sovereign by nature. You either had the geology or you did not. Compute is not. It depends on processors designed in California and manufactured in Taiwan, subject to export controls that can change with an administration. The Gulf can build the buildings and supply the power. Whether that constitutes owning the asset or renting it is a question analysts in the region are actively debating. Every extractive industry eventually meets the community it extracts from. Oil met it over pipelines, spills, royalties, and eminent domain. Computing is meeting it now at county commission meetings, and the industry appears to have been genuinely surprised. The tally is no longer marginal. According to tracking by Good Jobs First, of at least 63 local data center moratorium actions, 54 had already passed across dozens of towns and counties. Communities in at least 14 states have enacted temporary pauses on new development. In Indiana alone, Researchers at Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute identified at least 17 counties with temporary moratoriums, 11 with specific ordinances, and 2, Marshall and Cass, that banned new data centers outright. Nearly a third of Indiana's counties have moved to restrict them in some form. The objections cluster around 4 things, and the strongest one is not the one the industry expected. Noise from cooling equipment is real and persistent. Water consumption is contested. Palm Beach County commissioners rejected a proposed $2 billion project, citing unclear and widely varying estimates of its water demand. Land use and viewshed complaints follow every large industrial structure. But the argument that actually moves votes is the electricity bill, because it is the only one that shows up in every household in the region every single month, with a number attached. That is a difficult political position to defend. The economic case for these facilities rests on tax revenue, and the tax revenue is genuinely enormous. Data center assessments have transformed the budgets of several Virginia jurisdictions, funding schools and services at levels those counties could not otherwise reach. But the tax benefit lands in one county's treasury, while the capacity cost is socialized across an entire grid region. The winners are concentrated and the payers are diffuse, which is the classic structure of a political fight that the diffuse side eventually wins. The financial consequence is already measurable. Industry tracking indicated that in the first quarter of 2026 alone, community opposition delayed or blocked at least 75 projects with a cumulative value around $130 billion. Permitting risk has become a line item in the underwriting. And if you have been following this channel for a while, you know how this pattern usually resolves. The industry eventually pays for its externalities, one way or another, and the only variable is whether it happens through negotiation or through legislation. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which asset class you want examined next. I read them, and several recent videos started there. Return to the 4 properties. Scarcity that cannot be manufactured, flow rate, duration, fungibility. Measured against that test, the modern data center is a genuinely strange object. Its scarcity is real, but political rather than geological, created by interconnection queues, turbine backlogs, transmission permitting, and county votes, all of which are decisions rather than facts about the Earth. Its flow rate is the cleanest parallel. The megawatt has become the barrel per day, the number that determines how much value the asset can deliver and how fast. Its fungibility is emerging as compute begins to trade with spot and contract pricing the way commodities do. And its duration remains the open question, argued between an investor claiming $176 billion of understated depreciation and manufacturers pointing to observed 6-year utilization. So consider 2 conditionals and notice that both are consistent with everything documented in this video. What happens if the demand holds? Then this is the early phase of the largest infrastructure build since electrification itself. The powered landholders of 2026 become the reserve holders of 2045. And the counties saying no today will spend the 2030s watching that capital settle somewhere else. What happens if the demand does not hold? Then the buildings, the substations, the transmission, and the turbine slots still exist. Physical assets do not evaporate. But the debt written against 6-year hardware lives reprices sharply. And the losses land on securitization buyers, private credit funds, and the pension money behind them. Notice which of those 2 futures still leaves something standing. Fiber laid in the 1990s telecom buildout was radically overbuilt, and the companies that laid it went bankrupt. The fiber is still there. It carried the internet for the next 25 years, owned by whoever bought it out of the wreckage for a fraction of its cost. Infrastructure booms have a habit of destroying the builders and enriching the second owner. The oil field is not finished. The world still consumes around 100 million barrels a day, and will for a long time. But the marginal dollar, the next dollar of global capital deciding where to go, has already made its choice. And it made it in 2025, quietly, in a comparison of capital expenditure tables that almost nobody read. For a century, the most valuable thing you could own was access to stored energy. That has not changed at all. What changed is what we do with it once it arrives. We used to burn it to move things. Now we run it through silicon to produce answers. The asset is still electricity. It always was. We simply built a new machine to sit at the end of the wire, and the entire financial world is repricing itself around what that machine turns out to be worth.